Tambu ran barefoot along the muddy road, while the cold morning wind pushed against her wet clothes. Her breathing came fast and uneven as she held several old photographs tightly against her chest. Rainwater dripped from her hair, and mud clung to the bottom of her trousers, but she did not stop running. Far behind her, hidden inside the fading mist, stood the house. Even from a distance, the house seemed alive. Tambu tried not to look back because something deep inside her warned that if she turned around, she would see someone standing at one of the upstairs windows, watching her. One of the photographs slipped from her shaking hands and fell into the mud. She stopped quickly and picked it up. The photograph showed the front of the house many years earlier. The walls looked newer then, brighter and untouched by age. Standing beside Musa was a woman Tambu had never seen before. The woman wore old clothes, but it was not the clothing that frightened Tambu. It was the expression on the woman's face. The fear in her eyes looked painfully familiar. Tambu's chest tightened. She dropped another photograph. This one showed a different woman standing beside the same man. Different face, different year, but the same fear. Tambu's breathing became slower and heavier as she reached for the final photograph. This one was older than the others. The edges were torn and faded. At first, Tambu only noticed the upstairs window in the background. Then her blood ran cold. A woman stood behind the glass, still, watching. Tambu stared at the photograph in horror, because the woman standing inside the upstairs window was herself. Not exactly as she looked now. The woman was thinner, weaker, as though something inside her had slowly been drained away. Before she could fully understand what she was seeing, a loud sound exploded behind her. Somewhere deep inside the house, a heavy door slammed open. Tambu staggered backward in horror. Yet, when she first entered that house 8 months earlier, she believed she had married into a beautiful new life. The first thing Tambu noticed about the house was the silence. It was not the peaceful silence of the countryside or the quietness of a happy home far away from the noise of the city. The silence felt different. It felt heavy, strange, as though the house itself was listening to every sound she made. As the car moved slowly through the long driveway, Tambu looked out through the window at the huge property around her. Tall jacaranda trees stood beside wide green lawns, and the late afternoon sun painted a soft golden light across the walls of the house. The house was beautiful, but somehow it did not feel warm. Beside her, Musa drove calmly with one hand resting on the steering wheel. "You are very quiet," he said gently. Tambu smiled faintly. "I'm still trying to believe that this place is real." Musa smiled back. "You'll get used to it." His words sounded kind, but something about them unsettled her a little. The feeling disappeared quickly, and Tambu told herself she was only nervous because everything in her life had changed so fast. She had just gotten married. Now she was moving into a giant house far from the city. Of course she would feel nervous. Still, as the car drew closer to the front of the house, A strange feeling settled slowly inside her chest. The house did not feel empty. Several workers stood outside near the front of the steps to greet them. A gardener wiped his hands on his trousers before greeting them politely. Two younger maids stood together beneath the veranda, and beside them stood an older woman wearing a neat grey dress. Her calm face immediately caught Tambu's attention. Everyone welcomed her warmly, but something about the atmosphere felt strange. It was as if everyone there already understood something that Tambu did not. The older woman stepped forward first. "Welcome home, madam," she said softly. Later, Tambu would learn that her name was Miriam. For one brief second, Miriam lowered her eyes respectfully. Tambu noticed something unusual that made her stomach tighten. It looked like pity. The feeling disappeared so quickly that Tambu almost convinced herself that she had imagined it. Musa reached for her hand gently. "Come on," he said. "Let me show you around before it gets dark." The inside of the house looked even larger than it did from the outside. Long hallways stretched beneath the soft golden lights. Everything in the house looked expensive to Tambu, who had come from poverty. Framed photographs and old paintings covered the walls. Everything inside the house spoke of wealth. But beneath all that beauty, the silence remained, heavy and watching. As Musa guided her through the sitting room, Tambu suddenly paused beside one of the tall windows. Something had moved upstairs. Her eyes lifted slowly toward the upper floor. At the far end of the hallway above her stood the shape of a woman. The figure remained completely still behind the glass, watching her. Cold fear spread slowly through Tambu's body. Then Musa called her name, and his voice broke her focus. When she looked back at the upstairs window, the figure was gone. Tambu said nothing, but deep inside her, a quiet voice had begun whispering that something inside the house was wrong. Dinner that evening felt uncomfortable in a way Tambu could not explain. The dining room itself was beautiful. Warm lights reflected softly against the cutlery. The food smelled wonderful. Yet, something still felt wrong. Every silence between conversations seemed too long. Musa tried to keep the conversation moving. He asked whether she liked the gardens and whether she liked the rooms upstairs. Tambu answered politely. She even laughed softly once or twice. But part of her attention remained trapped upstairs. She kept thinking about the woman she believed had been standing at the upstairs window earlier that afternoon. She told herself again and again that she had imagined it. Still, every few minutes, her eyes drifted towards the hallway upstairs. And each time, it remained empty. Miriam entered quietly midway through dinner, carrying another serving dish. "You must rest properly tonight, madam," she said softly while placing the dish on the table. "The house can feel unfamiliar at first." Before Tambu could answer, Musa spoke calmly from across the table. "Oh, she will be fine." His words sounded harmless enough, but the speed with which he said them caused Miriam to fall silent immediately. Tambu noticed it. Later that night, after Musa left to answer a business call in the study, Tambu stood alone inside the bedroom, preparing for bed. Rain tapped softly against the windows outside, while the wind moved through the trees beyond the balcony. Standing before the mirror, Tambu slowly removed her earrings while trying to calm the strange unease inside her. Then her hands stopped moving. A woman stood behind her in the mirror. Tambu froze. Cold panic rushed through her chest. The figure looked blurred somehow, as though hidden behind smoke or water. But Tambu could still make out the shape of a tall woman. Slowly, afraid to even breathe, Tambu lifted her eyes toward the mirror again. The woman was staring directly at her, and she was crying. Tambu spun around sharply, but the room was empty. Only the curtains moved gently beside the open window, while the rain continued tapping outside. For several seconds, Tambu stood completely still, staring at the empty corner where the woman had stood. Finally, she turned slowly back toward the mirror. At first, she only saw herself. Then the woman appeared again. The crying figure slowly lifted one trembling hand and pointed towards the bedroom door. At that exact moment, someone knocked softly from the other side. Tambu's heart nearly stopped. The knock came again, soft, calm, steady. Tambu stood frozen before the mirror for several painful seconds, because part of her feared that if she moved away, the crying woman behind her would suddenly appear somewhere else inside the room. Another knock followed. Slowly, Tambu forced herself toward the door. When she opened it, Musa stood outside, holding 2 glasses of wine. The light in the hallway surrounded him, and for a moment, his calm expression made Tambu wonder whether she had imagined everything. Musa entered the room and placed the glasses carefully onto a nearby table before turning to face her. The faint smile on his face weakened the moment he saw the expression on Tambu's face. "You look frightened," he said quietly. Tambu hesitated. Part of her already regretted opening the door, because the experience sounded foolish now that Musa stood calmly inside the room. Still, she needed to know whether she was losing her mind. "I thought I saw someone in here," she admitted carefully. Musa remained silent for a moment. "You saw a servant?" he asked. Tambu shook her head slowly. "No, a woman." The room became quiet again. Rain continued tapping softly against the windows, while Musa studied her face carefully. Tambu waited for confusion, disbelief, or a nervous laugh from him. None of it came. Instead, he remained strangely calm. "What kind of woman?" he asked after a long pause. Tambu placed her hands on her knees. She was tall, thin. "I first saw her in the mirror near the curtains." Tambu lowered her voice slightly. She looked like she had been crying. For a brief moment, Musa's face changed. It was a small, quick change, but Tambu noticed it immediately. His expression did not look like he was surprised. It looked more like recognition. Then it disappeared. Musa walked slowly toward the window. "You've had an exhausting few days," he said gently. "Weddings take more out of people than they realize, especially when they suddenly find themselves sleeping in a strange house afterward. The mind becomes sensitive to every sound and shadow." His explanation sounded reasonable enough, yet something about it unsettled Tambu deeply. The words did not feel natural. They felt prepared, as though he had expected this conversation long before it happened. Tambu watched him carefully. "You don't seem surprised," she said quietly. Musa turned slightly toward her. "Why should I be surprised?" "Well, most people would at least look confused if their wife told them that she had seen a strange woman in their bedroom." Silence settled between them again while thunder roared softly in the distance. "My grandfather built this house many years ago," Musa eventually said. "Old places collect memories. Servants begin imagining footsteps. Shadows and faces appear in the mirrors. Eventually, these stories settle into people's minds." Tambu listened quietly, yet his explanation only made her more uneasy. It did not sound like a man dismissing something impossible. It sounded more like a man carefully trying to stop her from asking more questions. Musa stepped closer and rested his hands gently on her arms. "You are safe here," he said softly. The words should have comforted her. Instead, cold fear gripped her stomach slowly, because the moment he touched her, Tambu's eyes drifted toward the mirror behind him. In the reflection was someone standing near the bedroom doorway. A woman stood still and watched them. Tambu's breath caught sharply as she turned quickly toward the doorway, but there was nobody there. The hallway beyond remained empty, but when she looked back at Musa, another realization unsettled her more deeply. Throughout the entire moment, Musa had never once turned around to look behind him. It was almost as though he already knew what stood there. Tambu barely slept that night. Each time she finally drifted to sleep, she woke up again moments later with the horrible feeling that someone stood nearby watching her in the darkness. By morning, her body felt heavy with exhaustion. Musa had already left the bedroom. The empty space beside her felt cold when she touched it. Tambu sat up slowly and listened to the silence surrounding the house. Somewhere downstairs, she could hear faint movement from the kitchen and the distant sound of dishes being arranged. But beyond those ordinary sounds remained the strange stillness she had noticed from the moment she arrived. Even during daylight, the house did not feel normal. It felt watchful. After dressing quietly, Tambu made her way downstairs, where Miriam greeted her politely in the dining room, with breakfast already prepared. "You should eat while it is still warm, madam," Miriam said softly. Tambu thanked her and sat down, but her appetite remained weak beneath the growing unease inside her chest. For several seconds, she tried focusing on ordinary things: the warmth of the tea, the sound of the cutlery, the trees moving outside. But the memory of the crying woman in the mirror refused to leave her mind. Eventually, Tambu looked at Miriam again. "Have you worked here for a long time?" she asked. Miriam nodded faintly. "Long enough," she replied. The answer settled strangely between them. Ever since arriving at the house, Tambu had sensed something hidden beneath Miriam's politeness. The older woman always seemed careful whenever conversation drifted toward the house itself. "Then you must know this family well," Tambu said softly. For one brief second, Miriam's hands became still against the tray she carried. "I know this house well," she replied carefully. The distinction unsettled Tambu immediately. Outside, the clouds drifted slowly across the pale morning, While silence settled once more between the two women, Tambu lowered her voice instinctively. "Since arriving here, I've had this strange feeling that someone else is inside the house," she admitted quietly. "Yesterday, I thought I saw a woman upstairs, and last night I saw someone standing behind me in the mirror." The reaction inside Miriam was immediate. Her fingers tightened visibly around the tray. Her eyes flickered briefly toward the hallway beyond the dining room. For several seconds, she said nothing. Then she lowered her voice carefully. "You must not let the house disturb you, madam," she said softly. "Sometimes it is safer not to pay attention to certain things." A cold chill spread slowly through Tambu's chest. "You have seen something too, haven't you?" she asked. Miriam did not answer directly. Instead, her eyes drifted slowly towards the staircase before returning to Tambu again. "Some houses carry sorrow for a long time," she said carefully. "Unfortunately, the sorrow does not always stay buried." Tambu frowned softly, struggling to understand what the older woman truly meant. Before she could say something, she heard footsteps approaching from the hallway. Miriam straightened immediately, every trace of openness disappearing before careful professionalism, as Musa entered the dining room, adjusting the sleeves of his shirt. "Oh, there you are," he said warmly, smiling at Tambu. "I thought you might still be asleep." The atmosphere changed instantly. As Musa moved closer, Tambu noticed something unsettling, because Miriam never once looked directly at him. Instead, she quietly picked up the tray and moved toward the doorway. As she passed beside Tambu's chair, she paused briefly and whispered so softly, the words barely rose above the silence surrounding them. "If the voices call your name at night, do not answer." The rest of the morning passed beneath a quiet tension that Tambu could not shake, no matter how hard she tried to focus on ordinary things. Even after Miriam left the dining room, her warning continued moving through Tambu's mind. The words unsettled her deeply, because Miriam had not sounded like someone repeating old village stories. She sounded serious, as though she already knew what could happen. Musa, however, behaved as though nothing unusual had happened. He spoke warmly throughout breakfast and talked about meetings he needed to attend later that afternoon. He even asked Tambu whether she wanted the driver to take her into town if she needed anything. His calmness should have comforted her. Instead, it unsettled her even more. It felt as though two different versions of the house existed at the same time. One belonged to daylight, polite conversations, expensive furniture, and careful smiles, while the other belonged to silence, whispers, shadows, and women who appeared only when nobody else seemed willing to acknowledge them. By midday, Musa had left for town. The moment his car disappeared, the atmosphere inside the house changed. The silence no longer felt restrained. It felt awake. Tambu tried reading for a while, but she could not focus properly. Eventually, she rose and wandered slowly through the hallway downstairs, studying the framed photographs lining the walls. At first, most of the pictures appeared ordinary. Some showed family gatherings, some showed holidays, and others showed formal events from earlier years. Musa appeared in many photographs at different ages. Then Tambu began noticing the women. At first, she assumed they were relatives, or family friends appearing naturally throughout the photographs. Yet something about them immediately unsettled her. Many of the women stood slightly apart from everyone else. Their smiles looked forced. Their eyes looked tired. And almost all of them carried the same strange expression: fear. Tambu moved closer to a particular photograph hanging near the stairway. The picture looked old, perhaps 20 years older or more. Musa stood beside a beautiful woman wearing a pale blue dress. Yet, despite the faint smile on the woman's face, fear remained clearly visible in her eyes. Tambu's stomach tightened. The woman looked familiar, not because Tambu knew her personally, because her expression reminded Tambu of the woman she had seen inside the mirror. A chill ran through her body. She stepped closer. Then she noticed something else. The corner of the photograph had been damaged, not accidentally. The woman's face had been scratched repeatedly with something sharp, until the woman's face had almost disappeared. Tambu stared in confusion. Why would someone destroy only her face? She continued moving along the hallway. Another photograph, another woman, another damaged face. Some images were scratched, some were torn. And in one photograph, an image had been completely cut out, leaving an empty space beside Musa. Fear tightened slowly inside Tambu's chest. She continued walking carefully until she reached the final photograph hanging near the far end of the hallway. This one stopped her completely. The frame looked newer than the others, but the photograph inside appeared unfinished somehow. Musa stood alone in front of the house, wearing a dark suit, with an empty space beside him where another person should have been standing. Tambu frowned. The longer she stared at the image, the stranger it became, because the empty space did not look accidental. It appeared prepared, as though someone had once existed there before being carefully removed. Slowly, Tambu lowered her eyes toward the bottom of the frame. There was no date, no description. Only one word appeared: Tambu. The air seemed to leave her lungs. She stepped backward in confusion, while cold panic spread slowly through her chest. The photograph was much older than her relationship with Musa, much older. Then a faint sound drifted through the hallway behind her. These were not footsteps. It was the sound of someone breathing. Tambu turned sharply, but the corridor remained empty. Silence stretched heavily around her, while her pulse hammered violently inside her ears. Then the sound came again, breathing, faint, weak, and close, as though someone was hiding somewhere directly behind the walls of the house. Tambu remained frozen beside the photograph, while the faint breathing continued coming from somewhere beyond the wall. At first she tried convincing herself it was only wind moving through old pipes, but the sound felt natural. It sounded like a human being. The breathing was slow, weak, and painful. Her pulse hammered painfully inside her chest as she stared at the wall beside the unfinished photograph carrying her name. Every instinct urged her to walk away immediately, yet something stronger held her there. The breathing suddenly stopped, and silence swallowed the hallway again. Tambu released a shaky breath and stepped backward carefully. Then a voice whispered her name. The sound was faint enough that she almost believed she had imagined it. But deep inside, she already knew the truth. The voice had come from inside the wall. Cold terror rushed through her body. Tambu turned sharply toward the photograph again. Nothing moved. The hallway remained empty, and another whisper followed, calling her name. This time, the voice sounded weaker, strained, as though speaking required enormous effort. The softness of the voice frightened her, because beneath the weakness, Tambu heard desperation. Her breathing became shallow, and Miriam's warning returned instantly. If they call your name at night, do not answer. Except the voice was not calling her at night, and whatever whispered from inside the wall already knew her name. Tambu backed away slowly while staring at the unfinished photograph. The empty space beside Musa no longer looked empty. It felt occupied. Then came something worse, a soft knock from beside the wall. Tambu's fear tightened violently into panic. She turned and hurried quickly down the hallway, fighting the overwhelming urge to run. Every shadow stretching across the polished floor suddenly seemed alive. By the time she reached the sitting room, her hands were trembling badly. She tried focusing on ordinary things to calm herself down. The flowers near the windows, the soft clicking of the clock, the distant sound of birds outside. But none of it helped, because deep inside her, Tambu already understood something terrifying. The house was haunted by memories. Something inside it was alive. Later that afternoon, storm clouds gathered heavily across the sky, while thunder roared faintly in the distance. Tambu remained inside the sitting room pretending to read, though she could not concentrate. Every few minutes, her eyes drifted nervously toward the hallway, waiting, listening for something, because the house felt different after hearing the voice, not merely strange, but aware. As evening approached, Miriam entered quietly, carrying fresh candles in case the storm interrupted electricity later that night. The older woman immediately saw Tambu's face. "You heard something, didn't you?" Miriam said softly. Tambu lowered the book slowly. "There's someone inside the walls." The color drained faintly from Miriam's face, and for several seconds she said nothing at all. Finally, she placed the candles carefully onto the table. "You must never go looking for them," she said softly. Tambu stared at her. "Them?" Miriam's eyes shifted toward the hallway. "Do you know who they are?" Tambu whispered. The older woman looked deeply unsettled, as though every word she was about to say pushed her dangerously close to something she had spent years trying to avoid. "This house was not empty before you came, madam," Miriam said carefully. "There were other women." Coldness spread slowly through Tambu's body. "What happened to them?" Miriam opened her mouth slightly. Before she could answer, the lights inside the house flickered violently. Then darkness swallowed the room completely. For several seconds, neither woman moved. Rain hammered violently against the windows, while thunder rumbled loudly outside. Then Tambu heard it, the voices of women whispering, speaking slowly from somewhere deep inside the darkness of the house. The darkness inside the room felt unnaturally heavy after the electricity failed. Beside her, Miriam remained completely still. Even in the darkness, Tambu could sense the fear inside the older woman. It was not the ordinary nervousness of someone waiting for power to return. Miriam looked like someone listening carefully for something she hoped would stay far away. Then the whispers came again, soft, weak, women's voices moving somewhere deep inside the house. Tambu's pulse hammered violently as she strained to listen. At first, the voices sounded tangled together, too distant to properly understand. But slowly, certain words began separating themselves from the others. Don't let him. She must know. Before it happens again. The whispers drifted restlessly through the darkness like movement beneath water. Tambu turned sharply towards Miriam. Can you hear them? Miriam closed her eyes briefly before answering. Yes. Cold terror spread instantly through Tambu's body, because until that moment, part of her still hoped she was imagining things. But Miriam heard them too. Another whisper drifted softly through the hallway. This time, the voice spoke Tambu's name. The sound was weak and distant, yet unmistakably real. Miriam stepped closer immediately. Do not answer. Tambu swallowed hard while staring into the darkness beyond the sitting room entrance. The whispers moved constantly through the house. One moment, they were upstairs. The next moment, near the staircase. Then suddenly, somewhere deep within the walls. It felt less like voices moving through rooms and more like the house itself was speaking. The storm outside grew worse. Lightning flashed violently through the windows, lighting the sitting room for one brief second. And during that instant, Tambu saw them. 3 women, standing silently at the far end of the hallway. She let out a quick gasp. The figures appeared pale beneath the lightning, almost like shadows trying to become human. Then darkness swallowed them again. Miriam grabbed Tambu's arm immediately. Do not look at them for too long, she whispered. Fear tightened violently through Tambu's chest. Who are they? Miriam hesitated. When she finally answered, her voice sounded strange. They were Musa's brides, just like you. Tambu stared at her in disbelief. What does that mean? Before Miriam could answer, another flash of lightning filled the hallway. The women had moved closer, and Tambu's breath caught painfully inside her throat. There were 5 of them now, standing side by side, watching her silently. Their appearances remained blurred and unnatural, yet Tambu could still see something that made her stomach tighten. One woman wore an old-fashioned blue dress. Another looked completely drenched with water. One held her stomach tightly with both hands, and every single one of them stared directly at Tambu. The lights flickered suddenly, then returned. Warm golden light flooded the room once again, and the hallway was empty. Tambu's breathing became uneven while her eyes searched desperately through the corridor beyond the doorway. Every rational thought inside her urged her to believe the storm and darkness had confused her eyes. Yet, deep inside, she already knew the truth. Miriam slowly released her arm. You must leave this house before you disappear like the others, the older woman whispered. Tambu turned toward her sharply. What does that mean? Miriam looked toward the hallway again before lowering her voice even further. The house changes when it accepts a new bride, she said carefully. At first, it watches, then it studies you. And after that, her voice weakened. It becomes difficult to separate yourself from it. A cold unease crawled slowly beneath Tambu's skin. What happened to those women? Miriam opened her mouth to answer. Then the front door opened. Both women turned instantly towards the doorway as Moses stepped inside, shaking water from his coat. His expression remained calm and ordinary, despite the storm raging outside. Yet The moment his eyes settled on Tambu and Miriam standing together inside the sitting room, something unreadable passed briefly across his face. The atmosphere changed immediately. Musa studied Tambu carefully. "Why are you both standing in the dark?" Neither woman answered. Then Musa smiled faintly and walked slowly toward them. Behind him, far down the hallway beyond the entrance, Tambu saw one of the women standing motionless near the staircase, watching him. Dinner that night passed beneath a silence so heavy that even the smallest sound seemed too loud inside the dining room. The soft clinking of cutlery echoed sharply through the air, while rain continued falling steadily outside. Tambu barely touched her food. Across from her, Musa behaved calmly, as though nothing unusual had happened. He spoke occasionally about ordinary things, the roads in the town being busy, business calls that he had to attend to, and the bad weather. His normal behavior unsettled Tambu more than silence would have, because every few moments, despite trying not to, she remembered the women standing in the hallway during the lightning flashes. She remembered the drenched woman, the woman holding her stomach, and most of all, the final figure standing near the staircase. The woman had not been watching Tambu. She had been watching Musa, not with fear, but with hatred. At the far end of the dining room, Miriam moved quietly between shadows while serving tea. Tambu had noticed the older woman avoiding looking directly at Musa throughout the meal. Eventually, Musa set down his glass and studied Tambu carefully. "You have been quiet all evening," he said softly. Tambu forced herself to meet his eyes calmly. "I'm tired." A faint smile touched his face. "You still seem unsettled by this house." The words tightened something inside Tambu's chest, because they sounded less like concern, but more like an observation. Tambu lowered her gaze briefly. "It feels strange here sometimes." Musa leaned back slightly in his chair. "Strange? How?" For a moment, Tambu considered telling him everything. The whispers, the women, and the breathing inside the walls. But suddenly, a strong instinct rose inside her. "Do not tell him anything." The warning appeared so sharply inside her mind that it frightened her. "I think I'm still adjusting," she replied carefully. Musa continued watching her for several seconds before smiling again. "You will get used to it," he said softly. The certainty in his voice unsettled her deeply. Later that night, long after Musa had fallen asleep beside her, Tambu remained awake, staring into the darkness. Rain whispered softly against the windows while the events of the evening continued circling endlessly through her mind. Eventually, unable to bear the suffocating tension inside the bedroom any longer, she slipped quietly from beneath the blankets and stepped into the hallway. The house felt different after midnight. It felt awake, alive. Shadows stretched unnaturally beneath the dim lights, while the silence itself seemed layered somehow, carrying the faint sound of hidden movement. As Tambu passed through the downstairs hallway, something immediately caught her attention. One of the photographs had changed. Tambu stopped walking instantly. Cold fear spread slowly through her body as she stared through the picture hanging near the staircase. Earlier that afternoon, the photograph had shown Musa standing beside a woman whose face had been partially scratched away. Now the woman was looking directly at Tambu. Tambu's pulse quickened violently. She stepped closer. The change was impossible to explain, because she remembered the original image clearly. Earlier, the woman's head had been turned slightly sideways. Now her face was looking forward and she was pointing. Tambu followed the direction of the woman's finger. It was pointing towards the wall beside the photograph. The same wall where she had earlier heard breathing. For several seconds, Tambu remained frozen between the photograph and the wall. Then she heard it again, breathing, faint, weak, and human. It was coming from inside the wall. Tambu stepped toward it slowly. The sound became clearer. Someone was crying. The sound was soft, broken, and muffled behind layers of wood and stone, yet unmistakably human. Tambu pressed her trembling hand slightly against the wall. The crying stopped instantly. Silence swallowed the hallway. Then something touched Tambu's hand from the other side of the wall. A hand. Tambu felt it clearly beneath her palm. A human hand pressing weakly against hers from somewhere hidden inside the darkness of the house. It was at that moment that Tambu finally realized that something evil lived inside the house. What she did not understand was that the spirits were not the only thing she needed to fear. Part 2 follows.